Hello folks, welcome back to Management 5804, Leadership and Technology-Based Organizations. I'm Dr. David Townsend, and this will be lecture 3.1. In this lecture, we're going to spend a few minutes diving deep into the logic of disruptive innovations. And so this is probably one of the most important topics, I think, in the field of technology strategy, and certainly in the field of technology practice. I mean, I have lost count of the number of organizations with which I've worked, or heard pitches from, or just spoken with others about, or seen in competitions, or even seen their PR releases. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of companies have adopted the logic of disruptive innovations as part of their core strategy. But I think few concepts are more misunderstood than this notion of disruptive innovation. And so it's worth us spending some time to dive deep into the logic of this framework. And so we're going to spend the next few modules, this first third of the semester, really breaking this down. It's important to understand it in its granular detail because it's a very surprising framework that has very unique insights and makes a series of important kind of predictions, if you will, to help managers understand when something may be problematic for an incumbent company. And so if you're a company at the top of your industry, how do you recognize something that's coming from the real fringes of your industry that might put you out of business? And conversely, if you're a startup or a new entrant moving into a new market vertical, the logic of disruptive innovation gives you a bit of a playbook to help you engineer strategies that are going to give you a leg up against the competition. And so again, it's a crucially important framework and one that we're going to spend time with to help us understand how to apply these logics in our firms. So just in a way of recap, we spent a fair amount of time talking about the role of complexity, and we framed it up with this DINE model, and this notion that diagnostic, interactive, non-predictable, and these exponential changes in our technology environments create enormous challenges for us when we're trying to build and manage technology strategies. And so we spent some time in the last couple of units of talking about the difficulty of relying on the past, particularly the framing strategies that we may use that rely on past patterns. So what's happened in our recent history in industry as a signal of what's going to happen next. And that's not to say that their previous experiences aren't going to necessarily be a reliable guide, but it does point to some of the challenges that disruptive innovations pose, because again, disruptive innovations are going to change the playbook that happens in our industry. They're going to, we're going to see firms emerge with a different type of product or a different business model, a different strategic approach to reaching customers. And it's easy for us to ignore the threats that these disruptive innovations or disruptive companies pose towards us if we're an incumbent. And so again, it's a challenging thing to try to diagnose when the pattern is breaking from our recent history. And so given the challenges or the limitations of effective framing strategies, as we talked about in the last unit, really need to look for some structural patterns that we can rely on that can give us a roadmap to deal with change. And what's important about this is this roadmap, or this process of disruptive change through disruptive innovations, has played out across a variety of different industries. And I think there are important limits to the framework that we'll discuss in later units. But there's also a pretty clear sense that this pattern is something that's pretty fundamental to competition in many markets. And so it gives us a way to really comprehend and understand and also predict what's going to happen next. So by way of roadmap, we're going to spend some time in this particular lecture talking about the problem of disruption, and then talk about the logic of disruption. And then we'll spend some time in additional units talking about this notion of an extendable core. And this is really important to understand in terms of why new entrants are able to supplant or disrupt industry-leading incumbents. And then we'll talk about some of the controversies around disruptive innovation, whereas if companies are entering in at kind of the low or the high end of the market, and then which customer segment should you be targeting. But our particular unit today is we'll talk about the problem of disruption, and then in lecture 3.2, we'll talk about this jobs to be done framework. This is an important framework that's emerged as really a complement to the logic of disruptive innovation. So it's something important for us to understand because it gives us even more insights into understanding how to frame or how to build products that meet customer needs. So the notion of disruptive innovation is very counterintuitive for many people. Because again, we tend to think about competition and tend to think about new entrants or new new companies, the sort of the plucky, aggressive, brand new to the world innovator in the entrepreneurial venture, sort of this heroic actor that emerges is taking apart all the old inefficient industries that lack successful recipes for dealing with this new era that we're in. And so again, this is the way we tend to think about it, that companies fail or companies die because of some deep flaw or deep problem that they have in their strategy. And so we can point to many companies that have gone bankrupt and have been disrupted, so to speak, by new companies entering into their space because these new companies were able to exploit lots of inefficiencies or problems with products. But the notion of disruptive innovation is actually far more subtle and much more subversive than that. And what this really is a framework that explains the failure of great companies. I've got good companies there. I'm shouting at you on the PowerPoint slide here. But these are companies that are often industry leaders. They're the ones at the top of their market. And so we talked a little bit about Nokia and Research in Motion. These two companies were really at the height in dominant market share in the smartphone market when Apple entered their market. These companies were doing many things right. They were listening to their customers. They were continuing to improve their product offerings, but they were still disrupted. And this is a pattern that plays out over and over and over again as great companies who are in the lead somehow find their legs cut out from underneath them and the company falls really at the height of its power. And in fact, as the framework, as the reading highlights, it's precisely because the companies are so successful that they're leaving themselves so susceptible to disruption. And so we'll talk about some of the logic as to why in some future lectures. I'll spend a little bit of time on it today, but also we'll continue to connect those dots when we move into the second set of units and we talk about the technology adoption lifecycle, because it's success at moving through those different stages that oftentimes creates this recipe to leave you disrupted. And so again, what this framework does is it challenges the kind of the lazy narrative that oftentimes emerges with investors or the press or even us who like to armchair quarterback managers of these large companies. And we blame it on poor management, right? They somehow were just ineffective. They didn't see the important opportunity that was emerging, or they made massive mistakes. And boy, we could do so much better because we're so much smarter than them. And again, that's a narrative that often emerges to explain why people fail versus the structural pattern of disruption, which is something embedded and is common into the competitive dynamics between incumbents and new entrants. And so the innovator's dilemma really is this trade-off between short-term brilliance. The company as an incumbent is doing things extraordinarily well, but they trade off that versus this long-term myopia. And so to a degree, they're missing the forest for the trees, right? So they're focused on executing short-term brilliance. They're doing an incredibly great job of meeting customer needs, but then something shifts in their environment and they miss out on a broader structural change and a long-term opportunity. And so this tension is really at the heart of the innovator's dilemma. And so disruptive technologies, which makes them so difficult oftentimes for incumbents to recognize, is that the innovations oftentimes result in worse product performance early on. And there's a particular reason for that, and that we'll talk about here in a bit. But fundamentally, many disruptive innovations have radically different value propositions vis-a-vis the products that are targeted really at the mainstream of the market. And so again, the success that a company has of going into the mainstream, of reaching the core, the majority of customers with these excellent products, causes them to kind of ignore people that are on the fringe. And so customers that aren't really important, that may have very idiosyncratic or very unique preferences or needs for products or services, or, and importantly, maybe they don't want an overly engineered bundled product that has all sorts of features that the typical mainstream customer would want. They want something specific within that product or service, and so they're willing to pay for it. They're willing to kind of purchase a new product in order to get access to a particular new feature that's emerging. And so it's because incumbents are doing such a great job of focusing on the majority of customers that's what causes them to miss things that are happening on the fringe or the outside of their market, right? These unmet customer needs. And so in the middle of that, these mainstream companies are continuing to invest to improve those product offerings. So here's the third but major ingredient here of disruptive innovation, is that it's leveraging an asymmetric rate of technological change. So what do I mean by that? The pace of technological change, we oftentimes assume that that's what's fueling the new entrant, right? That's what they're riding this new wave that's emerging, and the old, slow, behemoth large company is too slow to recognize the opportunity, and so they miss out on it. But oftentimes it's exactly the opposite, right? The technological change is leading these incumbent companies to double down, to drastically improve their product offerings, that they start to outpace the preferences of their mainstream customers or customers that are fringe of the market. And so the rate of disruption oftentimes is inversely related to it's positively correlated to the rate of success of the incumbent company of incorporating these new features into it. So you're getting better as an incumbent, you're building better products, but at the same time, you're outpacing what your customers really want from it. And so these things together produce these differences between incumbents and new entrants. And so we see these two lines here, this progress due to sustaining technologies. And so this is a company that's continuing to invest to build up a new product or service that or improve a current product or service that they have. And so this is Apple continuing to invest now in the iPhone to add new features. They're not changing it radically. They're not making any major shifts to the underlying architecture of the product, but they're continuing to add and refine and improve. The price point also starts to increase, and at a certain point, all the features that come built on that phone far outpace what a mainstream customer wants. And I would argue that I think we're starting to approach that point with Apple, which is going to leave them very susceptible to potentially new disruptive innovations around smartphones or some kind of mobile communication or social technology that solves a limited set of needs for fringe customers. But why disruptive technologies tend to supplant the incumbent is because the rate of progress that they have actually, the performance of that disruptive technology, even though it starts off much worse, right? So we see this sort of starting points of these two lines. This line across the bottom, it's way low on that y-axis there, right? So it's really horrible performance almost at the beginning, but it improves dramatically and continues to climb into the mainstream of that market. And again, we'll continue to talk about this because there's multiple layers we're going to add on to it. But that basically is creating this fundamental challenge for companies. And so these factors together, right, and this trade-off between investing and sustaining in disruptive innovations is built around kind of a couple key principles, right? So the first principle is resource dependence. Companies depend on their customers and investors for resources. And so the more successful you are at reaching the mainstream, those established customers don't want you to change oftentimes. They don't want you to improve or to try something radically new. And so, there's no customer right now that's clamoring for Apple to get rid of the iPhone in order for some wearable computing device, and let's just say, Google Glass 3.0 emerging or something along those lines, right? Assuming that Google Glass actually figured out how to position the product to solve a problem for, some set of customers. But nobody's arguing. Nobody in the mainstream wants Apple to change. The second principle we'll talk about is small markets don't solve the growth needs of large companies. And so this is also why these large companies, these incumbents, also miss disruptive innovations happening at the fringe, because each of these fringe markets is oftentimes very small and it doesn't do anything for the large company. It's not a big enough opportunity. And so they may be aware of those customers starting to peel off and purchase a new product, but it's a small market, it's at the fringe. The third principle is markets that don't exist can't be analyzed. Right, so this is one of the major things. Again, if you're seeing a really tiny market that's just emerging, or you're seeing customers start to, at the fringes with particular idiosyncratic needs, starting to peel off and go after some new radical disruptive product that's out on the market, you don't basically see any value in that because you can't analyze what that market's going to look like. So you don't know how to invest or to design a product to meet those needs. But principle number 4 is that process of disruption starts to kick in. Your capabilities define your disabilities. And what we mean by this is that your success at reaching mainstream customers and as an incumbent are the very things that can create the liability for you and then the challenges you face of adapting to a new world that you're facing. And so within that, this exponential improvement of a disruptor, right? This is part of this challenge of complexity, is where you start to see some challenges as an incumbent of responding now to this rapid improvement and the rapid growth that you're facing. All right, so as we look at this, right, here's this crucial question. This sort of pace of technological change is causing incumbents to improve more rapidly than customers prefer. On the right-hand side there, this comes from the reading. As you can see that the slopes there, and this is actually plotted from real data in the disk drive industry. And so you can see over this 15-year period, the improvements in these technologies start to diverge from the underlying demand in those different markets, right? So what customers are wanting and what the technology can do, those things start to diverge. And so the more you see technological improvement with incumbents start to diverge from what customers really, really want. So you have products that become over-engineered and become too well-designed, too incredible, with too many different features that people don't want. Eventually, those disruptive technologies beneath there start to intersect with those lines. And that's really at the point of disruption. And what we're seeing here, and you've seen this graph before, and you'll see it a couple times more, is we're seeing this rapid amount of technological change. So if anything, this process of creative destruction is speeding up, but these technologies oftentimes and the rate of change actually benefits incumbents relatively robustly. And so incumbents can benefit with this rapid improvement that they can continue to refine. So we think about Apple's ability, given the pace of change in software and mobile technology, is able to radically and pretty rapidly improve the functionality of the iPhone. But perhaps it's getting to a point now that it's starting to outpace what we really want from the phone, and that's going to leave them susceptible at the margin of people starting to peel off. But again, this rate of technological change isn't fueling the disruptor per se, but it's actually leading to that divergence between the incumbent technology and demand. Now, on the flip side, some of you are saying, but those lines still are a lot steeper, if you will, for those disruptive innovations, and that is absolutely true. And so the pace of technological change does benefit the disruptor, but it's only because there's a divergence in the mainstream of the market, right? And so there's a particular reason why this happens, and we'll talk about this notion of a whole product solution being critical for reaching mainstream customers here in a few weeks. But that's really, again, at the heart of the problem here, is that you're building these really robust, incredible products as a market-leading incumbent, and you're using technology to do that, but then something radically new happens and it starts to improve dramatically, and it offers a very new value proposition, which leads to disruption. And so let's unpack this question here, because this is oftentimes the story that people use to talk about disruption, right? And so if we think about Blockbuster vis-a-vis Netflix, and we'll talk a lot about this S-curve, right? And we know from some of our reading so far that the S-curve is this pattern of new innovations that emerge. And so people oftentimes tell this story about Netflix disrupting Blockbuster. And if we look at the curves here, they're actually quite interesting overall, because at the rate of growth, I mean, Blockbuster, you see kind of this blue line, was doing actually quite well up until about 2002, 2003. And then things started to change. And then the overall rate of growth started to decline. And at the same time, you see Netflix going through its core growth, and you see them kind of at the bottom of the S-curve. But what's interesting here, right, if we look at it, there doesn't seem to be a perfect correlation per se. It's close, but there's not a perfect correlation here between the rate of success or the rate of growth that Netflix goes through versus Blockbuster's decline. So something kicks in here that starts to slow down the rate of growth of Blockbuster. And again, so there's more to the story than just Netflix disrupting Blockbuster. And again, we see some changes, we see some shifts from purely mail order DVDs versus being able to go into the store to rent a Blockbuster video. We see some shifts to streaming. Now, what's interesting is Blockbuster still around the same time try to shift their business model into moving into streaming. So as an incumbent, they tried to adapt, not right away, but relatively quickly to the new streaming world, and were unsuccessful in doing it. So why is Blockbuster bankrupt, right? And again, Netflix plays a role in this, but perhaps there's another player or more information that's relevant. So let's take a look at some changes between 2008 and 2009. And just to give us some context, again, that's right in this spot here, kind of a little bit between, we've got these two lines between 2004 where Blockbuster really peaks, and 2013 where it's declining rapidly, to today where I think there's literally only one Blockbuster store left in the northern hemisphere. And so literally it's gone completely from this massive behemoth of a company to one store left, right? The last store standing. And so in the middle of that, this rate of decline between 2009 and 2013 is where Blockbuster sees its most significant decline in growth, negative 59%. So if we look here between 2008 to 2009, we see the blue line represents Blockbuster, right? The orange line represents Netflix. The red line represents Redbox. And the gray line represents other types of video stores. So these are movie gallery, Hollywood Video, and other local independent movie stores, right? So we do see a broader story of disruption where both Blockbuster and these other video rental places decline. And we see, 7%, so 23% to 30%. So it's about 6.4% an added, market share or rental unit share between Netflix in 2008 and 2009. So in this year that this disruption really kicks into high gear. But hey, what about the red line here? Redbox, 9%, goes from 9% to 16.8%, right? So we see in terms of actual rate, it's not doubling, but it's getting close to doubling in terms of its overall market share. Think about this for a moment. Would Netflix have truly disrupted Blockbuster by itself if Redbox hadn't entered the fray? And Redbox in many ways is a more classic disruptor to Blockbuster than Netflix was, because it had a similar business model, but it leveraged the technology of Coinstar, this ability to use vending machine kiosks to rent videos. It mimicked at a lower price point what Blockbuster could offer, but it had strong technological capabilities which allowed it to do that. And so it is not a story of Netflix riding the streaming wave and able to supplant Blockbuster. And in fact, there's kind of an interesting what-if scenario. Perhaps Blockbuster could have adapted to the new streaming world if they weren't being undercut by Redbox at the same time. So it's the combination of both, I'll argue, that played the crucial role in putting Blockbuster out of business, because it had no leg to stand on. Netflix was starting to rapidly capture streaming. Blockbuster tried to shift at the same time its core business was being undermined by Redbox. And you can see here, as you kind of look through, the overall rate of growth starts to really climb exponentially during this time frame. And that's really where Redbox is going through its tremendous amount of growth. And so fundamentally, right, the story of disruption for Blockbuster was that it was undercut by two different trends, but it really was the business model shift that Redbox introduced that created the problem. And now, interestingly enough, because we're seeing a massive shift to streaming, Redbox is trying to adapt to that particular world and is not doing very well. And so they're seeing a significant decline in their overall revenue and sales because, again, they haven't fully adapted. They're trying to release a streaming service. It has almost no penetration in the market. At the same time, you're seeing huge amounts of streaming. So if anything, and I would argue that Redbox may be the primary reason that Blockbuster went bankrupt, and that streaming is now really kind of entering into the fray. Now, the case this week, we're going to think about maybe Netflix is also ripe for disruption, and maybe some new ideas that potentially could be problematic. And so again, look at the picture, think about the historical context, and think about these things that are happening. In 2008 and 2009, that shift where we start to see that massive decline in the overall growth rate of Blockbuster, I would argue is more directly impacted by Redbox than it was purely by Netflix. Netflix starts to grow. Blockbuster could have potentially jumped to a new S-curve had they had the chance, but Redbox literally used a pretty successful disruptive innovation in a very effective way to supplant their role in leadership in that market. So overall, right, one of the things we're going to talk about is just the potential of a bad playbook. And so we'll cover this in the next unit because this is fundamentally important for us to think about, that many times these technologies that end up becoming the core of a disruptive strategy were developed by the incumbents themselves, but because the tech was pitched by marketing personnel, mainstream customers didn't want it, it's given out or not capitalized on by incumbents. And so we'll spend some time thinking about this with Ford and Ford's mobility investments as a way that company is trying to stave off this challenge of disruption.